worked for a really big MSP. One of the reasons I got hired was really to kind of focus on efficiency, right? Uh, it was a really big MSP. They've been around for, I would say, 15 years. They were still firmly placed in a lot of older processes or processes, if you're an American. Canadians say process, Americans say process a lot of the times. Anyways, long story short, I was there to kind of improve and modernize. So one of the first things I started with was looking at all of the different things that we were kind of contractually obligated to support, right? We had 3 different spam vendors, 3 different applications that we use for mail security and for spam. We had probably 5 different backup solutions. I'm trying to think of, there was so much more. Anyways, long story short, we had over 70 products that our sales team could insert into a program, whether that it was a fully managed program, a proactive, or even, any kind of a la carte they would come up with. And it became increasingly hard to support a tech stack that vast. So one of the things I wanted to focus on was really kind of service delivery improvements, right? So that's where I really wanted to focus. So what I did was I created what was called a data mart. And the data mart kind of allowed me and our general manager, who I reported to at the time, really understand what customers had what, but also it was a great exercise for our sales team, or at least our account management team. So I created this basically a matrix. If I had it, I have it on my home computer. I can show it to you another time. But I created basically a matrix of all of the different technologies that we had internally that we would go to market with. And then I would map that across to all of the customers we had. We had roughly around 800 customers when I first started. And it took a long time because between ConnectWise and the agreements that we had, some things were documented, some things were sitting in paper. It was a bit of a mess, but it was a really great exercise to create this data mart. And this data mart was really, it kind of evolved over time, became much more than what I thought it was going to be. To me, it was really kind of shoring down the service delivery into something consumable that we can actually manage, right? Then it became, hey, let's reduce the amount of vendors because we've got so much technology sprawl. Then it became, well, we have now a go-to-market strategy because now we've got customers that are missing parts of our tech stack, right? You bring on a technology, but your customer's been with you for 3 or 4 years, but somebody hasn't talked to them about this new technology or this new part of your program or what have you. So it was a really great way to enhance our operations, right? So I started with just the technology that we had internally. Now, you might be a smaller MSP and you might not be around for 15 or 20 years like the MSP that I worked with. They started off as a VAR, value-added reseller, back in the day, but they were really trying to do more and more around managed services, especially fully managed services. So that's where I started, and it became immensely successful because we quickly noticed that, for example, certain customers didn't have any mail security or spam protection. So that was a good way for our account team to then call up that customer, work with the stakeholder, and then position it, right? So that was where we kind of that evolved into kind of some next steps. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question, Irene. If it does not, please let me know. Next question from Richard. My MSP is about 4 years old, and I feel like we don't have key metrics to share or track. What would you recommend that we focus on? Most of what we do is manual. Great question. One of the things I did focus on when I worked for this MSP I worked for 2 different MSPs, but one was kind of a behemoth. You know, if you go onto like the CRN top 500, they're like a top 20 MSP. So roughly around $100 million in revenue, et cetera, et cetera. So when I was there, they didn't really have a lot of metrics. They had some. They knew what some important ones were based on kind of the industry stuff that was going around them. But I really wanted to kind of focus on what was going to bring the business a lot of value. And being a former sales guy once upon a time, I guess I'm still somewhat a sales guy. You never really leave it. We're all in sales, you know, whether you like it or not, or customer service, right? It's one of those things where my GM recognized when I first started with that data mart that we had a huge sales team. And what we really wanted to understand was the value they were going to provide. So I started off with some sales and marketing metrics, right? That's really where I started. Now I did some things. I presented some dashboards and you know, things like commissions, opportunities, you know, the number of dials they had, email campaigns. Now this was a really big MSP, so it was very kind of easy for me to track a lot of this stuff because we were using things like HubSpot, or we were using various other tools that I could really glean a lot of information from. So that's where I kind of started. But then I kind of realized that I wanted to kind of get more in depth around the tech. You know, inherently I am a tech. I've been an IT guy for roughly, you know, 20 some years. So that's where I kind of started, because I've written blogs on metrics before. So I've actually mapped a lot of this out. So whenever I get asked about metrics, it's like, I'm trying to think of probably the 3 dozen that I've created over the years. So I've written some of them down. Now, this isn't like, you know, the gospel. There's a lot of other industry leaders who know metrics way better than I do, but I'll kind of give you some ideas about where I started. So when it came to agreements, right? And again, we were a ConnectWise partner. So all of our agreements or all of our contracts kind of resided in ConnectWise Manage, you know, invoices, what have you, and then I could report on it. And what I did was I ended up querying a lot of this through SQL. So one of the ones I started with was, you know, just monthly MSP agreement revenue. I needed to track revenue on a monthly basis, right? Now we were doing a lot of this, but it was either sitting with finance, what have you. What I was trying to do was get the business involved in, you know, get out of these silos, right? That's what happens with larger companies, even at Enable sometimes. Sometimes the left doesn't know what the right's doing and the right doesn't talk to the left about the important things in larger companies sometimes. So what I wanted to do was really kind of have a place that key stakeholders across the business, whether you're in marketing, whether you're in sales, whether you're in service delivery or tech or IT or what have you, you could all kind of see the same picture. So again, I started with monthly agreement revenue in USD, right? I would say, because I work for a very large Canadian MSP, I would say the majority of our contracts were actually in the US. Then I would want to look at things like the effective hourly rate for MSP agreements. I then looked at managed service devices per agreement. Then I looked at number of managed users. And then I looked at managed users per agreement, obviously keeping some averages, right? Was it 20, 50, 100, you know? You bring on, most of your customers might have 20, 25, 50, but you bring on one behemoth customer, and next thing you know, your managed users per agreement can balloon up to 100, right? And then number of managed devices. And this is where I started under agreements, kind of revenue, just some light metrics. And I told my CFO, I didn't have a dotted line to the CFO, but I worked somewhat closely with the CFO back in those days. And, you know, they were completely fine with me kind of working through this and getting these metrics and talking to sales about them and everything else. So that's where I started, was just some basic metrics in agreements. And then I put them into a product called BrightGauge, because we were a BrightGauge partner at the time. And I would just create these dashboards, and they would query ConnectWise manage, and it would pull all this stuff for me. So people were like, wow, this is witchcraft, you know, like, because they never had it before, right? So now I've got the vice president of sales understanding, you know, the same picture as finance, right? It was a very important exercise. And then I started out with, especially on the service delivery side, we were a 300 employee organization. Okay, so what I really then wanted to do was focus on key metrics around, you know, how good we were or how bad we were. To be honest, I wanted to kind of understand what our pain points were. So one of the first things that I wanted to understand was CSAT scores. And I couldn't. Initially, I couldn't, because we weren't tracking this. What's that? How's that phrase go? Not measure twice, cut once. It's if you don't measure it, if you don't monitor it, you can't measure it, or something to that effect. But this is a really important exercise because you really need to understand a lot of different aspects. So you need to understand what your customer thinks of you, like the business owner, the people who are paying the bill. You need to understand the people that you're supporting. So what we did, we had one platform. Basically, it was a platform to really determine our NPS score as a business. And it went out to a key stakeholder at that place that we would have a contact at, and they would give us a monthly score, right? You know, are we doing this? It was several questions, and it would formulate a score called the NPS score. But what we didn't have were surveys. I wanted to understand that every time a tech interacted with a customer, that we were getting something back out of it, or they were getting something out of it. So I wanted to understand what our CSAT scores were. So we created surveys, and we used a particular product called Customer Thermometer, which was also integrated into ConnectWise, so that every time they would close a ticket, it would generate a quick email and say, hey, how did we do? And would have these batteries where they could click, like battery is low, battery is full, and somewhere in between. So they would click on one of those, and it would auto-register the score as 1 through 3 or 1 through 5 or whatever we had it set up for. But then they can add feedback. And that's where I was tracking that through Brightgauge, right? So that is where I gleaned a lot of great information, especially early on. Who I thought were my best techs weren't always my best techs. Some were very, very technical, like outwardly on the floor or the pods that we were working in. You know, some of these guys were really great. They talked to me. We talked tech and I'd understand them. But that's not always the same experience that the customer was getting. So there was a disconnect. Just because you're a great person, you know, someone I can have a beer with, doesn't mean you're going to give that customer the same experience, right? So that is something that we really wanted to improve on. So that is another key one that I implemented, okay? Now, I have MSP reactive tickets with a CSAT response versus proactive tickets, right? Proactive tickets are a little hard because typically you're proactive solving the issue before your customer is hopefully getting involved. But when you're getting requests, when you're getting customer generated tickets, typically you'll get a CSAT response with those. And then I also wanted to understand, and these are some older metrics, right? MTTR, mean time to resolution, average call handle time, which initially I had no visibility into call times, right? I could talk for the next hour about telephony, only because it was such a pain for me. I had zero visibility when I got there, and I'm like, hey, it's 2018. What do you mean we're using like landlines, right? I need some unified communications that have, like, I need call center type software, right? I need some basic stuff. You know, how long are these guys on the phone for? How many calls are they taking? You know, is someone just on mute for or and a half. I saw a lot of cool stuff when we started changing the phone system, right? So I started getting more and more metrics around telephony. Eventually, it took a long time, like close to a year. But then I started getting average call handle time, speed, what they were doing, right? How many calls they were getting. Some techs were doing 30, some techs were doing 5. Same role, still same L1 position, but some were and consistently doing 5, where others were doing consistently 30. So I had overachievers, and then I certainly had some underachievers, right? That is the kind of visibility that you need. I don't necessarily need to understand, like I'm not a micromanager, and I hate micromanaging. I will if I have to. Please do not give me a reason, but it's one of those things where basically if 1 + 1 = 2, then, well, I already know, right? I don't need to micromanage that, right? I know that if you're doing 5 calls per day and Sheila is doing 30, and she's a rock star and our customers love it. She's got great CSAT scores, but you're super technical and you're doing 5 calls, Sheila's got way more value, right? So this is the kind of stuff that people didn't understand initially when I first got there. I had to do, because I reported to the senior leadership team. So I would go into board meetings, or these, not board meetings, I would go into these weekly meetings and present and talk about what I am doing and how I'm trying to invoke kind of some transformation, right? And not everybody was for what I was doing, right? People are, especially in a large business, well, I think generally in any business, some people can just get very nervous about change or being put under the microscope. I really tried to partner with, and I'll give you an example. Our professional services team probably hated me. I'm not even kidding you. These guys were like the gods, the tech gods of our business. They were de facto internal IT. They were de facto security. They ran all of our systems. And I had to change all of that. And they weren't happy with me. That is for sure. Long story short, just to kind of get off a tangent here, is that I'll go into one other key metric here. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so one of the other, I'll give you 8 more if you want to jot these down. MSP hours per ticket, tickets per device, and another good one is reactive hours. How does it go? Reactive hours per device. There's a formula. You can actually see how much effort you're putting in versus what your RMM or what you're doing proactively. That's really where I kind of evolved to. All of my reactive hours, I needed to track how much time were we taking, and on calling people and emailing people and all that reactive stuff that we have to do. Some of it's necessary, right? Take it, customer calls in, someone has to react to it. Like, I get it, but it also made me realize that I needed to focus more on automation. And that was a 2-year journey at the business I was in, because we didn't have a NOC team. Even though we talked about proactive, or fully managed or whatever, we weren't living it, right? So it was one of the things that I had to spend a lot of time growing a team. I had to start a NOC. I had 5 people. They reported to the service delivery manager, but it was me and the service delivery manager that kind of spearheaded this, right? Because we needed to look and see what were the problems and respond to them proactively before the customer did, right? That is how you get raving fans. Tickets remediated with automation. So I would track all of the automation and whether or not the ticket stayed open or whether it stayed closed. Tickets with 1 touch resolution. Devices per tech. That's a kind of an old industry standard, and it varies widely. The median is typically around 250, but really great MSPs can do upwards of 750 to 1,000 sometimes. Sometimes you're a little overworked at that point, But it really depends on your MSP business as well. Seats per tech, right? So obviously I want to know kind of scale of my business, right? L1, L2, L3, knock, that kind of thing. Just general ticket information, right? Proactive tickets, reactive tickets, RMM generated tickets, and then hours per ticket type, right? So based on that proactive, reactive, and RMM tickets, how much time were we spending on each? And of course, you would look at like reactive tickets. That's where all the effort is, right? So another argument to do more automation.